Wuhan, not Chernobyl. How is it that mistaking Wuhan for Chernobyl, for thinking that, this, well, explain to us, what do you mean by that?
Well, it was a kind of unfortunate coincidence that the HBO series on Chernobyl had kind of reawakened memories of that disaster in the 1980s that helped to destabilize and delegitimize the Soviet regime. And so when COVID struck in China, a bunch of folks, senior journalists in the West, but also Chinese netizens who were all over the kind of TV, cinema rating sites, started drawing parallels between the catastrophe that was unfolding in China, the failure of the regime to contain the disease, and that incident, which in the end many people think helped to bring down the Soviet Union. And what was revealed at that moment, in my mind, is sort of wishful thinking, right? That folks expect China to fail. It's just a matter of time, and this was the thing that was going to bring China down. And if we had been able to stop the clock in February, that would perhaps have proved to be a theory with some legs, because this was a failure of the Chinese regime. It was a failure of the reporting chain they put in place after SARS in 2003. And the things they had to do, the lockdown that they had to implement in China, was the severest economic and social shock that China has suffered really since the beginning of the reform period in the 1980s. But in a sense, what that narrative doesn't reckon with is, A, that the regime was able to respond in a dramatic way, in the way that the late Soviet regime in the 1980s absolutely wasn't. And it really doesn't reckon with our own incompetence. It doesn't reckon with the total failure of first Europe and then the United States to get a grip on this disease, which was coming towards us predictably through channels which we fully understand and can easily map, namely global air travel, with weeks of warning. I mean, the only excuse you can really make for Beijing is that they were the first to encounter this disease and didn't have any prior warning. We did. And for most of February, we basically slept.
Yeah. Well, and arguably even December and January, I recall that there were reports that our government, that the Trump administration was getting reports as early as November that something, from satellite imagery and basically spies, that something's going on in Wuhan, and it looks like it involves an infectious disease.
Absolutely. But I mean, that is, as it were, the sort of more speculative end of the story. From the 20th of January 2020, there's just no excuse. It's on Chinese television. I mean, the Chinese General Secretary of the party and the president is admitting, hands up, we have a huge problem here, and we are now going to do radical things. And what really strikes me, and it's not, I would say I was myself party to it. Like, it's really a wake-up call to us all in the West to understand what it means when we say glibly, we're all tied together in a global world, we live in a global village, everything is so interconnected. But then when it gets serious, when it gets real, all of a sudden we find all sorts of excuses and reasons to actually not take serious the fact that we're interconnected. And for me, Chernobyl stands for that, right? It exoticizes it. It makes it feel like something that's ancient history, first of all, and in some provincial, Ukrainian town behind the Iron Curtain. And that is not our reality. Wuhan is a city of 10 million people, affluent enough so that half of them, for the Great New Year's holiday, traveled outside the city, and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of them went on long-distance trips. So when something like that happens there, when Beijing has to cut Wuhan off, all of the lights need to go off around the rest of the world. We need to react immediately.
Yeah, and hopefully we will the next time. You also write we're talking with Dr. Adam Tooze, author of Shutdown, How COVID Shook the World's Economy, how essentially what this pandemic has demonstrated to us is that the world's financial stability, and you argue, and I would emphasize this, even political stability, is also dependent on and interdependent with or interpenetrated by the natural environment. We're certainly seeing this in a big way with global warming, but this pandemic is another example of that.
Yeah, I mean, the most sort of extraordinary example today might be the situation in California in the summer, right, where they couldn't fight the raging historic forest fires because the teams of prison inmates they normally rely on to do the most dangerous firefighting were quarantined as a result of an out-of-control COVID epidemic within the correctional system. And at that point, you really begin to realize how, structures of social inequality, racial inequality, and environmental crisis come together in just a conflagration, really, a whirlwind that we are not ready for, and are not doing the concerted work and making the investments that will be necessary to prepare us better.
Well, and speaking of that, I know here in the United States, many of our hospitals have become commercial enterprises. I've talked many times in this program and written about how back in the 70s, I owned an herbal tea company in the early 1970s. We had 18 people working for us, a little factory, and we were bagging up herbs and selling them around the world or around the country. And healthcare, we provided healthcare to all our employees. It was cheap, and the reason it was cheap was because at that time, the law was, in Michigan anyway, and it was the case in most other states in the United States, that all the hospitals had to be nonprofit organizations and all the health insurance companies had to be nonprofit organizations. And, the Reagan Revolution blew that all up, and hospitals have become now major profit centers. And that has not served us well in this pandemic.
No, it really hasn't. I think it extends all the way up the food chain. It's an amusing story, perhaps. This book is being published in Germany this week as well, and it was translated. And one of the points I make about the inadequate funding of the World Health Organization is that the World Health Organization's budget at $2.5 billion a year is smaller than that of any major American urban hospital complex. And my German editor looked at this and said, Professor Tooze, there must be an error here. You must be wrong. And I thought, oh, my God, have I got this wrong? And I looked. In fact, it's just the truth. The big commercially operated hospital systems in the top 20 American cities have larger budgets than the WHO. Wow. So they have become, exactly as you say, huge profit-driven enterprises which issue debt, some of which is junk-rated, right? So these are actually leveraged enterprises. And there was a question during this crisis of whether they could survive, right? Because the ultimate perversity was that to prioritize the treatment of COVID, we had to shut down all elective work. And it's in the elective work that they make the money. So the largest single sectoral impact in terms of recession that America experienced was, I think I'm right in remembering this, the healthcare sector itself. So at the moment that we were, really desperately struggling to prepare and to maintain the functionality of the healthcare system, it was suffering an economic and financial disaster. And we actually, in the CARES Act, substantial amounts of money were committed to bailing out, essentially supporting the healthcare system. So it isn't even free to, as it were, dispose of its formidable resources. And of course, the best of American hospital care and medical care is as good as any in the world. We weren't even free to deploy it towards the public purposes because these are commercial entities and they were at risk of failure.
Yeah, and is your prescription for that we go back to requiring that hospitals be not-for-profits and that we break up some of these hospital monopolies? I mean, is this just a symptom of neoliberalism that needs to be repaired, or is this just a crisis that we have to acknowledge and say this is the way it is? Sorry.
Well, I mean, this is a question for an American healthcare reform expert, but you can tell from my accent I'm born English, and our national healthcare system is, to my mind, by far and away the most obvious and efficient way for rich societies to organise healthcare. It's also the cheapest way to organise it because it eliminates the incentive to bargain in the wrong way. And for me, the ideal of healthcare is the one that I experienced when our daughter was born, almost more than 20 years ago now, and my then wife walked in pregnant. We came out with our darling little daughter, and no bill changed hands, no signatures went on anything. It was just simply a badge of your citizenship, that if you're a family expecting a child, you go to the hospital and you come out with your child, and that's the end of the story. Right? No other transaction is involved at that moment, because obviously it is the mother and the baby that have to be the priority. And that is the ideal, surely. So anything that heads in that direction has my vote.
Tooze, I know that we touched briefly on the 2008 financial crisis and some of the, in the very beginning when I was asking you about the disruptions that we saw and the role of capitalism and all that. But the lessons of the 2008 financial crisis in some ways helped us deal with 2020, apparently, particularly at the level of the Fed, but in some ways absolutely did not. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, this was a completely different type of crisis. We have made some improvements, like the banks didn't fail this time. I mean, imagine if the banks had been as badly capitalized as they had been in 2008. It would have been an apocalyptic scene. We haven't, on the other hand, fundamentally reformed finance either. So what we do is we crisis fight. We learned lessons about the scale of fiscal policy. I don't think there's any doubt that the folks around the Biden administration, many of the economic policy team actually come out of the Sanders campaign, know that, as it were, one of the mistakes made in 2009 was that the Obama team didn't go big enough. So now they've gone bigger this time with regard to fiscal policy. But I do think the jury is out as to whether or not we've really broken with the past in a fundamental way. And this brings us to this issue of neoliberalism. Certainly, if you think of neoliberalism as a sort of doctrine, a set body of ideas, it's broken. Like, it's broken beyond repair. No one self-respecting intellectually, I think, thinks it can be rescued. But at the level of economic policy making, as it were, what we do and the tools we use, and the way in which those tools, like Fed action, are entrenched within, and this is the crucial follow-on point, a social structure shaped by neoliberalism since the 1970s. Your argument, for instance, about the medical system, of course, associated with that is a medical profession paid as it's never been paid before. In the same way, in the Fed and in the monetary system, we're talking about a giant overgrown financial system to which the Fed is connected. At that level, the ideas may be broken and we may be in a new world in that respect. But when it comes to the practice and the social interest associated with it, there's a really high measure of continuity.
How so?
Well, because the way the Fed acts repeatedly entrenches and reinforces existing biases, existing inequalities. Because when you pump money into the financial markets, it's the financial markets that get it first. And only 10% of Americans have any kind of stake worth really talking about in equities in financial markets. It's one of the biases of the financial news that they constantly tell us all about what's happening to the S&P 500, but it's only a minority of people who have any real investment in it at all, despite all of the hype about, Reddit and Robinhood and those kind of investment platforms. And it's really the top 1% that have very substantial shares, and their wealth is the flywheel that the Fed uses. Behind Fed monetary policy is basically a trickle-down version of how economic policy works. So every time you resort to that tool to stabilize the economy, you entrench that social interest. Whereas when we get to something like unemployment, America doesn't really have a functional unemployment insurance system that covers the whole country. But we don't reform that. We don't fix that problem. We just simply pump money in, which is way better than nothing, don't get me wrong. And it saw people through the crisis in 2020 in a way we never have before. Poverty actually fell. We should believe those numbers. But it doesn't fix the underlying problem.
Yeah, and it's a system that was put into place in the 1930s. It's getting creaky. Professor Adam Tooze, his new book, Shutdown, How COVID Shook the World's Economy. We were talking just a moment ago about how neoliberalism and the financialization of our economy not only have whacked the middle class for the last 40 years, but and just wreaked havoc with our political system. I think many have argued that the 2016 election of Donald Trump was, a direct response to this 40-year Reaganism experiment. But it also did not leave us in good shape for this pandemic. When we combine that with this being the first major crisis of this new era, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this, the Anthropocene.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. In other words, the anthro-human. This is now the first in the eras of the history of our planet, the first one that has been largely shaped not by comets hitting us or whatever, but by human activity reshaping the world. How is this confluence of neoliberalism and the advent of this new cycle era in the history of our planet and this COVID? How do these things all tie together?
It's a train wreck. I mean, it's an absolute train wreck. And the book, I have to say, doesn't offer any easy answers. What we are looking at is a kind of rubble field of failed projects to a certain extent. One thing I think we should warn against is the over-optimistic idea that the end of neoliberalism as a coherent intellectual project means we can somehow wind the clock back. to the era of the New Deal. I'm a keen advocate of the vision of the Green New Deal because it, I think, offers us a way forward, but we have to be clear about what the political obstacles are. And I think, the last couple of years of congressional politics have taught bitter lessons in that respect. Its diagnosis that we face a triple crisis, environmental, economic, and social, is spot on. But can we, gain purchase for that? We have to add another component here when we're talking about the environment, and it's China, and it obeys its own logic. It's not reducible, I think, to the Western model of neoliberalism. That's where this virus came from, either from a lab that went badly wrong, and there are loads of labs in China and loads of labs here, and so we should expect that kind of snafu, or from the relentless growth of Chinese society into what's left of the wilderness there. Either way, it is China's growth that produced this risk factor for the world. China managed to cope with it better than us, but going forward, China's phenomenal economic growth over the last 2 decades has totally transformed the climate problem, for instance. So in a sense, we are in a world in which, yes, we have our national and European and American stories of the crisis of neoliberalism. We have this mounting environmental crisis at the global level. But when it comes to CO2 emissions, China is responsible for as much as Europe, the United States, and the rest of the rich countries of the world put together. So the truly daunting prospect is that we really don't have our fate in our own hands anymore. I mean, we can do our best to make ourselves more resilient, more flexible, more nimble in the way we respond, more creative. That is, as it were, what our politics should be directed towards. But we should not kid ourselves. And this is one of the things I worry about a little bit with the Green New Deal. But, the New Deal ends with World War II and victory over fascism and D-Day, and then, as it were, the greatest generation that moves on from there. That's a horizon which is no longer really ours at this point. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't push for progress and reform and everything that we possibly can at home, but we should be clear about what scale that operates at. And where these risks are coming from, that's a bigger, wider global thing that we are really only a part of, a big part, and we have huge responsibility. And frankly, we should be doing our best to contribute to whatever solutions we can come up with. But we shouldn't kid ourselves into believing that we really control our own destiny here.
Yeah, it is an interrelated world, as it were. You write in the book, Shutdown, about a she session, how the gender disproportionate impact of this virus. To what extent is that a consequence of culture versus the way our economy is established? I realize that one feeds the other, and what might we do about that? And we have just a little more than a minute left before we're going to hit the end of the show here.
Inequality is all over this crisis, right? Inequality along rounds of race and along lines of gender. And women were in the front line of this crisis in every respect. It's their jobs that are hit hardest. It's they, obviously, who do a huge amount of the care labor in the hospital system. And it is women also that balance, in most households, the heaviest burdens of both domestic and paid work. And this was the first recession in which women's unemployment surged above that of men. And this reflects shifting patterns in the labor market. We are now an economy in which more women are employed than men. And so, as if by a kind of perverse fate, the first major recession to come along hits this society, and it produces a majority of unemployed being women. Unprecedented, especially in the minority communities. To have the peak levels of Latino unemployment that we did was really without any kind of a precedent. And so that has to be, this is why I think the CARES agenda of the Biden administration is so fundamental, because they are focusing on the dimensions of inequality and economic prosperity that impact women and impact families for the first time.
Absolutely remarkable. A brilliant book, Shutdown, How COVID Shook the World's Economy. Professor Adam Tooze is the author, professor of history at Columbia University. We've spoken before about Crashed, how a decade of financial crises changed the world. Dr. Tooze, thanks so much for dropping by today. It's been great talking.